So my name is Kate Giannini. I serve as the communications specialist for the Iowa Watershed Approach project at the Iowa Flood Center. And if you don't know, the Iowa Watershed Approach project is a $97 million HUD-funded project that was awarded in Iowa in 2016. It's a 5-year project, so we're coming up on year 4, and I can't believe I'm saying that. It's just gone really fast. And the program works to aim at reducing flooding in the state, improving water quality, and also improving community resilience in 9 select watersheds across the state. As part of the IWA program, I get the opportunity to work with our presenters. They're all very involved with that program. And today you will hear from Antonio Arenas. He's an IIHR research engineer at the University of Iowa. Mary Beth Stevenson, she's a watershed project manager through the Iowa Department of Natural Resources in Eastern Iowa. Ross Evelsizer is at Northeast Iowa RC&D. Sharon Gaul is the grants project manager at the city of Dubuque. And Dr. Larry Weber is professor and researcher at IIHR and also co-founder of the Iowa Flood Center. Each of our presenters have some slides that they've prepared, about 10 slides or less, just to let you guys know. And they'll each have some time to introduce their slides and go through that, and we'll save Q&A towards the end. And as we do our transitions, I'll provide a more detailed introduction to each of our speakers. So first up, we have Antonio Arenas. Like I said, he's an assistant research engineer with IIHR at the University of Iowa. Arenas has a PhD in civil and environmental engineering and has been working with computation models applied in water resources management for more than 9 years. Antonio's research focuses on the development and application of surface and subsurface watershed models to assess mitigation projects directed towards flood damage reduction and also the fate and transport of nutrients. Dr. Arenas and I travel often together, attending Watershed Management Authority meetings where he is presenting at and also presents to conservation groups, other conservation groups, and provides technical expertise to a variety of groups across the state. So welcome, Antonio.
Well, I prepared 6 maps to share with you today. So maps that I put together with data that I downloaded from the FEMA website, the USDA website, and the Sheldus database, some database that Eric mentioned, that has information on financial losses in relation to natural disasters. And I will be showing maps from the Sheldus database, of course, related to flooding. But before I go into the maps that I mentioned, so I want to share with you these 3 satellite images from this southwestern corner of the state. Fremont County is there. So satellite images were taken at 3 different days, November 16, 2018, March 16, 2019, and March 21st, 2019. And I put together those images for you to be able to see the extent of the flooding that was going on in March of this year. So the November 16, 2018 shows relatively low flow conditions. And I forgot to mention that the red lines in the images show the levee system. So low flow conditions are shown in the image of the left. On March 16, that is, of course, 3 days after the bomb cyclone impacted eastern Iowa and eastern Nebraska, and western Iowa. And about at that time, both the east and west Nishnabotna rivers and the Missouri River were moving peak flows. For the Missouri River was a little bit above 300,000 CFS, and for the Nishnabotna River was in the order of 40,000 CFS. And interestingly, on March 21st, about the same amount of water was moving south through the Missouri River, and the only difference is that the levee system had failed and over 50 levee breaches were already happened. And that's why you see the Missouri River actually occupying its natural and as opposed to its man-made floodplain. A colleague of mine calculated some interesting numbers. So the distance between, or the area, I'm sorry, between the Missouri River and the red lines from Council Bluffs south, it is about 25 square miles. And the area that was inundated by the Missouri River on the March 21st picture is about 6 times that. So 135 square miles were flooded in that photo. Back in 1988, the US Congress enacted the Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act to help local and state governments when devastated incidents like this happened. And I downloaded data from the FEMA website, like I said, to create this map. And this map shows the number of counties in 2019 alone that received a presidential disaster declaration. So 19 counties did not receive a presidential disaster declaration, but 80, of course, did. And those are the ones shown in blue in the map. Is 2019 the only year for which we have presidential disaster declarations in Iowa? Unfortunately, the answer to that question is no. We have 2018 with 34, 2017 with 9, 2016 with 27, 2015 with 19, 2014, 59, 2013, 86. And we need to go all the way back to 2012 to find the first year in Iowa's recent history without any presidential disaster declaration. But many of you may remember that in that year, what we had was not too much water, but too little water. And what we had was actually drought conditions. And federal dollars were flowing to Iowa, not through FEMA, but through the USDA crop insurance program. So here, this map shows basically the same information. The number of times that counties in Iowa showed up in the FEMA database in relation to flood-related disaster declarations. And you see a total number of a little bit over 1,000 times over the last 3 decades. So 1,000 times, or a little bit more actually, counties in Iowa have received presidential disaster declarations because of flooding in the last 3 decades. And when you see, for instance, the counties in Northeast Iowa that are shown in dark blue, you see that the number of times that those counties showed up, like I said, over the last 3 decades in the FEMA database is between 16 and 19. So when you think about that is on average, those counties were being impacted by flood events severe enough to grant a presidential disaster declaration basically every other year. So that is as far as presidential disaster declarations, and I have here some estimations about direct property losses from flooding about from the same time. The last 3 years are not included in this map, so it only covers the period between 1988 and 2015, and the total number of direct property losses from the Sheldus database for the state of Iowa, it is close to $14 billion in those close to 30 years. That's the estimation from the Sheldus database. And I have also a map showing the direct crop losses, once again, from flooding over the same time window. And that is a total of $4 billion. So in that time window, we have close to $18 billion estimated in direct losses when you combine property and crop losses. And I think it's very safe to assume that if you include the last 3 years, that number will go very easily above $20 billion. And the last 2 maps that I have for you are from with data from the USDA crop insurance program. So based on the numbers that I was able to gather from between 1991 and 2018, about $10 billion have been paid to Iowa through the USDA crop insurance program. And the 2 reasons why there are more claims, more money associated to claims is because of excessive moisture, precipitation, and rain. And that's what I'm presenting there. $2.8 billion over the last close to 30 years, once again. And by the way, these numbers have not been adjusted for inflation. And the last map that I have here for you is not exactly about flooding, it's about drought, which is the largest amount of money in the database that I was able to find. And it is $3.6 billion in payments from the USDA crop insurance between 1991 and 2018 to Iowa. So that's all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. Our next presenter will be Mary Beth Stevenson with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. Mary Beth has served as the Iowa Cedar River Basin Coordinator for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources since 2010. She provides technical assistance to local groups to support watershed planning, grant writing, and educational workshops, technical expertise, and events. Mary Beth works closely with groups such as the Cedar River Watershed Coalition and a various diverse group of watershed management authorities in eastern Iowa. Welcome, Mary Beth.
Thank you. Great. Well, thanks everyone for the invitation to be here. Dr. Tockley, is he still here? Thank you so much for your presentation earlier. It was rather terrifying, but very interesting. And Dr. Tate, I found your presentation to be heartbreaking at times, but a really powerful call to action as well. So I've been learning a lot, and I'm excited to be here today. So we've been hearing a lot about extreme weather and sort of the individual city and county response to extreme weather. And I'm going to kind of scale that up a little bit and shift the conversation more to how we're promoting and enabling cities to be more responsive to these events at a watershed scale. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes talking about watershed management authorities. I see a lot of familiar faces in the office, in the audience. I know that a lot of you guys are familiar with WMAs, but for those that aren't, watershed management authorities are intergovernmental cooperative agreements between cities, counties, and soil and water conservation districts and certain types of water quality districts. And WMAs in Iowa are made possible through legislation that was passed back in 2010, actually in a direct response to the 2008 floods. So the legislation created the framework for watershed management authorities to form. They didn't grant any regulatory or enforcement or taxation authority to these WMAs, but they did create this mechanism to develop a legal framework for cooperation. And so the purpose of WMAs is to allow the cities, counties, and SWCDs really to work together at the watershed scale, right? Because we know our water quality issues, our flooding issues, they transcend our jurisdictional boundaries. So we need a mechanism for these groups to be able to work together. So the first WMAs came online back in 2012, and this occurred through a pilot program that was set up by the state of Iowa using 2008 disaster recovery funds. And the program was set up in two phases. The first phase awarded funds on a competitive basis to a limited number of groups who wanted to pursue forming a WMA. Nobody really knew how it was done. There is some guidance in the Iowa Code thanks to that legislation, but nobody really knew what it meant for cities and counties to work together in this new way. So those six received some funds to help set up the legal documents and do the necessary outreach that was needed in order to get all of the member entities on board. So the second phase of the pilot program then offered watershed planning dollars to those WMAs that had successfully been formed. And so with that, we had our first 6 WMAs created in 2012 who began to forge a path for how to do watershed planning at a more regional scale, which really hadn't been done before in the state of Iowa. So fast forward now to 2019, the map that you're seeing in front of you is where we have watershed management authorities today. So we now have 26 across the state. They span 37% of Iowa's land area. They touch on 77 counties. So you can see there's starting to be pretty good geographic spread of our WMAs. And so I wanted to address a little bit some of the big accomplishments. You know, what have WMAs been up to since they started to emerge on the scene back in 2012? And so let me start with watershed planning. Watershed management plans are absolutely critical for the work that we do, especially when we're working at a more regional scale. We need to do assessments and studies to understand what sub-watersheds are highest priority and need resources to be more heavily targeted towards them to address specific water quality and flooding issues. So that's why our watershed plans are important. Right now, we have 22 out of the 26 WMAs that have either completed watershed plans or are in the process of doing so. So that's a pretty significant workload for the WMAs, really contributing to our work across the state. So once you have your watershed management plan, then it becomes time to implement that plan, right? And that's where a project coordinator becomes absolutely critical. So right now, 16 out of our 26 WMAs have access to some level of project staffing. There's 10 full-time watershed coordinators that are employed. Some of them are shared across several watershed management authorities. John Swanson, raise your hand, he's one of those, works in Polk County and provides great assistance to WMAs there. So most of the watershed coordinators are funded through a grant. The Iowa Watershed Approach funds a number of these, as you heard from Kate. Also, a couple of watershed coordinators for WMAs are funded through grants from USDA NRCS. Not all WMAs are lucky enough to have those grants right now. A couple of those that don't have managed to cobble together some funds to help pay for at least a part-time person who can keep driving the bus, calling the meetings to order, getting the minutes out, doing some limited information and education and coordination, and writing grants. And that leads me to my other point about where WMAs have been successful, and that's in terms of obtaining grants. So out of our 26 WMAs, 22 have had or currently have access to some type of grant funding. And they've been using that to support their watershed planning efforts, to pay for their coordinator, just kind of kickstart their efforts. So that kind of gives you a snapshot of where watershed management authorities are at today. But I also wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about why I think WMAs have the potential for success when it comes to building resilience to extreme weather events. But first, an anecdote. This is a photo of the Cedar River in 2008. The photo was taken in Cedar County. Cedar County now leads the Lower Cedar Watershed Management Authority. They were just awarded a planning grant from Iowa DNR to develop a comprehensive watershed plan. By the way, I wanted to mention this. DNR has invested almost $976,000 towards watershed planning for WMAs. We really believe in WMAs. We see that there's a resource need out there for more watershed planning, so we've been investing in that. But back to the photo here, this is a pretty powerful image, right? These are life-changing events. Our local leaders, they don't want to just stand by and wait for the next big event to happen again. They want to find a way that they can be proactive, that they can collaborate, and start to find solutions to these watershed scale issues. So in terms of how WMAs can be successful, I'd say really they're building that social infrastructure that you heard Dr. Tate talking about earlier. And they're doing this in a couple of ways. One is through local capacity building. We have local elected officials, city, county staff who are coming to these WMA meetings and hearing these great technical presentations. And I've heard WMA board members who, some of them perhaps haven't gone to college, asking extremely sophisticated questions about hydrology to Antonio and Larry. And it's pretty powerful. And they're doing that because they now know what kind of questions to ask because they're coming to these meetings. Also, I've been in meetings where we're discussing really complicated watershed planning efforts, and local leaders are making decisions about how best to allocate funds to make sure their watershed plans are addressing their own local needs. So as far as building equity, some of the watershed plans that are now being developed by our WMAs are starting to build in the social vulnerability indicators that we heard about from Dr. Tate earlier. That's new. It's very important. So I want to wrap up. Kate asked me to sort of predict the future a little bit. I get asked the question a lot. What would it take for the state of Iowa to begin to fund watershed management authorities at some level? So obviously I'm a DNR employee, not advocating for funding or anything along those lines. But in my opinion, what it would take is a good level of project coordinator staffing. So this is a map here that shows the 56 major subbasins across the state of Iowa. If we were to fund a project coordinator within each one of those subbasins, that would cost the state of Iowa about $4.2 million. That's a lot of money, right? But when we're talking about billions of dollars that it costs to respond to extreme weather events, we start to realize that $4.2 million could actually be a pretty wise investment. So with that, I'll wrap up and hand it over to Ross.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Ross Evelsizer is our next speaker. He's a watershed planner and also a GIS specialist for the Northeast Iowa RC&D. Ross facilitates watershed planning and implementation in the Turkey, Upper Iowa, and Upper Wapsie watersheds, and they're helping them work towards a more resilient landscape by improving water quality and reducing their impacts to flooding. Ross is also leading Multi-Cropping Iowa, which is a grassroots effort to implement regenerative agriculture practices that are both environmentally and economically sustainable. Ross has a degree in geography, GIS, and communications from South Dakota State University. Welcome, Ross.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you. I'm very humbled to be able to speak with you today. There are a number of other watershed coordinators and experts in the room, so I'm honored to have the opportunity to share some of the experience that we've had. And if you're paying attention to Antonio's maps, I hail from Northeast Iowa, where we work with 3 major basins, as Kate mentioned, and the frequency of flooding that we've experienced in that particular part of the state, while flooding has impacted all of Iowa at certain times, we're lucky enough to have had it the most, so lucky us. In that, in working with these major watershed groups, I did just want to share some of the major things that we've found to be successful and has helped us along the way. And so the first thing I think that is really important in our watershed work is working toward a common goal. The whole watershed concept is really just recognizing, and this was a struggle, I think, at the beginning, it was that, well, it's your fault, or it's your fault. It's not anybody's fault. We all live in a watershed. Whether you live at the top of the hill or the bottom of the hill, if you're rich or poor, if you're a Republican or Democrat, it does not matter. You live in a watershed and these things impact you. So really just kind of getting that out of the way to begin with and say, okay, maybe these don't affect everyone at the same level, but they are an issue. They're not going away. And how do we come together then to move forward and start to look at solutions? The other thing that is really important is, as Mary Beth mentioned, we have kind of a diverse group that are represented on watershed management authorities, and they're communities, soil and water districts, and county boards of supervisors. Anybody in the conservation world knows that these are not necessarily groups that typically work side by side towards a common goal. So watershed management authorities provide a unique platform then to do so. So it's really important to engage all of those different memberships when we're working towards, again, working towards that common goal, because they all have a role to play. We come from each of the watersheds that we work with in Northeast Iowa are extremely rural. So maybe the urban areas don't have necessarily the same level of impact in terms of their potential flood reduction in what they can do, but their role is very critical, especially when trying to engage with rural landowners. So that leads me to the next point, which is to trying to foster, and I think we're seeing this more and more, especially in the state of Iowa, fostering urban and rural partnerships. We're starting to see more and more communities reaching out to adjacent landowners, and I've actually seen it now enough that I'm seeing it both ways. So we're seeing landowners reaching out to communities and cooperating in terms of if the community's at the very top of the watershed, they're touching base with those landowners directly adjacent to community when there's development, so that everybody understands that the city is, if there's development, the city is taking the precautions so that they're not causing issues for downstream landowners. And vice versa, where you see communities that are actually reaching out to upstream landowners that may have land that could be used for some mitigation practices that would then reduce the impact of flash flows on that community. So we're seeing it both ways. Those sorts of urban-rural partnerships are becoming very pivotal in how we move forward in tackling these issues. Dr. Tate will appreciate this as a fellow geographer. Looking at these large-scale watersheds from multiple scales. The Upper Iowa is the smallest of the watersheds that we work in. It's about 640,000 acres. The Turkey and the Wapsie are both right around 1 million acres. Okay, so these are very large areas that we're working in. Watershed management in the past historically has not been done on that scale. It's traditionally done at the Huck 12, 30 to 50,000 acre watershed. So now we're talking about 1 million acre watershed. So you have to think about things in terms of multiple scales. So that means we're thinking about that city block or what happens on that parcel of rural land. But we're also thinking about how does what happens there impact that small local tributary and the neighborhood around it or the neighbors around it. And how does that fit into then the Huck 12 that is a major tributary to the larger than 1 million acre watershed. And luckily we can stop as a WMA maybe at that level, but then that's where we have folks like the Flood Center to think about how those pieces then fit into the statewide or even Mississippi or Missouri River Basin level considerations. And I think this has always long been true. This has probably been echoed throughout some of the morning presentations as well. There's no silver bullet. There's no silver bullet here. We're looking at a multifaceted approach. This is going to take a lot of different kinds of partners if we're truly going to become resilient at a watershed level. And so we're looking at trying to pull in maybe different partners that we don't typically work with. Maybe looking at public health, looking at disaster and emergency management personnel. How do we incorporate conservation planning and mitigation efforts into local county hazard mitigation plans? That's something that I think is new, but very, very important to do. And then looking at multiple ways to tackle this. And we're lucky enough now, from even when I started just about 7 years ago in this effort, to have a considerable amount more resources, largely because of the major universities and efforts there, the Iowa Flood Center certainly, but we have those resources, we have data to back up what we're doing and say, look, if we do this, we can make this sort of impact. So being able to quantify that is really big. But we're always coming back to, maybe what is the smartest use of everyone's resources, and we spent, basically all of our time in the past looking at how to move water out of the state quicker, how to get rid of it. So this is a complete mindset systems change for people to look at. And so shifting resources isn't going to happen quickly. Mary Beth touched on, 4.2 million or whatever it would take to fund a coordinator in every watershed. So we have to look at solutions that are, economical. That's kind of the direction we're going. And it may be as simple as, I put this picture in here because it may be as simple as looking at, a green plant. Is that the most simple solution that we have to work with, and it works at every level? So that's kind of the direction that we're going in our neck of the woods. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Ross. Next up, we have Sharon Gaul. She's a grants project manager with the city of Dubuque. Sharon has worked in land development and housing sectors for the last 18 years, and she currently helps administer the HUD grants, including the B Branch Healthy Home Program in the city of Dubuque. They're utilizing CDBG NDR funds to reduce water intrusion into homes, and that is part of the IWA project as well. The program employs collaboration with community and regional partners to identify and evaluate strategic outcomes with the goal of producing a replicable model that can be utilized in other communities facing similar challenges. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you, Kate. It is good to see some familiar faces around the room. And the reason I want to just bring that forward is I attended a conference a couple months ago on a different topic, but you have to realize when you're in the moment to make some change. And we're in that moment. We've seen a lot of presentations today about just the extreme ups and downs that we've lived. I've been on this earth for 40 years, and I don't remember floods of this proportion. Well, I grew up in the Nishnabotna Basin in southwestern Iowa. I'm now on the Mississippi. So, as Kate said, I'm in Dubuque. I'm going to kind of take you into a real deep dive about, I guess, the human factor in our city in an urban watershed, and go through some of the exterior interventions that we've been doing, a little bit about the interior as well, some advocacy efforts when we go into the home, looking at the social capital that we have in our city, and then that relationship with public infrastructure. And I've just got a couple of quick pictures here to connect people with your watershed and really let them know about the fact that we are all part of it, but even our fish out in the stream are our neighbors too, and we need to remember them as well. So a quick funding slide, because I've heard a lot of funding conversations this morning. After 50 years of disinvestment in our downtown neighborhood, in the year 2000, we started designing the B Branch Creek Restoration Project. If you haven't seen it, it's amazing. It's, I think, going on about 19 national awards right now. We daylighted a creek that had been buried. And it may sound crazy, right? But when you think about assessment values and that sort of thing, it starts adding up, right? So we've got some of the funding sources that we've seen over the last 20 years. We've got stuff that's going forward, and I had one citizen call it a $200 million ditch. That was a rough conversation, and I challenged them, but by the next time I saw them, if they could come up with how many millions of dollars damage have we seen in the past by not investing, and how much would we have going forward if we didn't do it. So challenge your communities is the same thing. Just to give you a little bit of scale, the B Branch watershed in the city of Dubuque is about 6.5 square miles. On the left here, you see some pictures of one of the corridors that we are actually right-sizing the sewer. And in the upper right, you'll see a brown home there that is actually one of our applicants. This is September 12th, a couple weeks ago. I got a call that very home was experiencing some massive flooding out front because that infrastructure project had started. I'm going to see if this will play. And I haven't. So out front, we were doing an infrastructure project to right-size that pipe, but Mother Nature just won't stop for 5 minutes to let us get it done. A dumpster had floated off and clogged the end of that pipe, and out went. I can tell you, though, the moment that it hit me was when a mother of 4 that lived on the right side of that duplex, we'd been trying to get a hold of her all evening. She was at work. Her kids had actually up the street asleep. She came home because we said, we're going to have to condemn tonight. We're not sure about the structure. We've got to get it checked out. And so she was given the direction, take what you need. She came out of her window because someone had her key, whole long sort of story, with a kitten that they had just gotten. By the way, she moved in 3 days prior. The clothing for her children the next morning for school, it was a Thursday night, and a new gallon of milk. And I think we're sometimes put in positions where we need to see the story. And I needed that story at that moment. And I think we all need that story. And if we can keep telling that story about how it really affects the human, I think we can move this conversation along. So I'll get into the basics really quick because I'm probably rolling on time already. But if you see a gutter like this that's not connected to the top of the house, that's not functioning properly. The top three things that we do are gutters and downs, soil modification and drainage improvements. We have houses that are literally this close together downtown. So where's that water going to go? Into the basement. I tell my engineers in the city, you've been using our basements as detention basins, but no longer. We're here to help. Some existing situations that we walked into, super easy. Raise those mechanicals up off the ground. And we'll start talking about some of the things you can do in your own community, but it's much easier to pass an ordinance or a policy in your small community than get a statewide or a national policy, right? But they're called cinder blocks. Raise those mechanicals off the ground. It buys you time. And that's a $5,000 expense that most of our folks cannot bear on their own. We didn't see the tuck pointing wave of need coming at us, but this is a really typical limestone foundation in Dubuque. Guess how much water it keeps out? Not a whole lot. And then that's actually a poured foundation, but they had a step area that was just draining water right into it. So we were able to take care of all of these items. Here's kind of a before and after of a basement. Years and years of water coming in. But inside there, almost all of the structures are getting what we call a humidistat fan. Look it up. It's basically a bath fan on steroids, but it direct vents to the exterior. How many of us have had to carry our water up from our dehumidifier? It's awful. This one just takes care of it, and you don't have to worry about it. But some really easy interventions that we've done. And then the third big component, so we go out and assess the structure, but we also assess the family or the person that's living in the structure, and we take a look at what some of their barriers are, right? If I have to put food on the table or fix my gutter, what do you think I'm gonna pick? So we've been able to take a deep dive and look at basically 5 areas that we wanna improve in our community and we wanna get better outcomes. Those better outcomes are just better comprehension, better utilization, or a better circumstance based on a resource that we are able to provide to our community member. These are the 5 major areas that we categorize all of the challenges in our community. And these are, so the percentages are basically what we're seeing across the board, all occupants. So this is great, right? But as we moved into the second half of the grant, we said to ourselves, we've got to really look at some of the subgroups that we're dealing with. So Eric mentioned it in his presentation, and that disaggregation is huge. So how one of our Marshallese residents deals with health challenges is much different than my white friend deals with it. And when we had to go walk that path the first time to get that kiddo that didn't have his Social Security card health insurance, it was rough. But we were able to document it, find the right partner to help us get that done, and now the next family we meet, it's easier. We also look at the difference between renter versus owner, and you can start seeing some disparities. The rest of this grant is going to be looking at why. Why do we see these disparities between these different subgroups, and what can we do about it? There's been 3 basic categories that have came out as far as challenges that have emerged. So when I look at some of them, a nationwide, and it's often systemic, orthodontia care for low to moderate income persons is getting very hard to find. There just aren't providers that are getting the payback, so they don't provide the service. That's not something in Dubuque we're going to be able to deal with, but we can send somebody to the Hill to try to advocate for that. The other one is a resource exists, but we're not really getting that optimal result that we're looking for. So we go out, we start working with the partners, say in workforce, and we put us all at a table and say, here's what we've been doing. How can we tweak this process to have more people skill up and do something more than they are right now? And then there's the barrier that's easily eliminated. We had a gentleman that had bought a wheelchair online, and the wheel kept going flat. This was his main mode of transportation, the way he got his groceries. But he couldn't think about getting a job if that wheel wasn't fixed. So we went out and we found a resource that was able to provide some funding to replace that. Boom, done, on to the next, right? In wrap up, I just want to mention that we've talked about the human factors, so that social side and the familial unit. We've looked at the housing structure, and our grant was able to provide funding to look at the public infrastructure. I can tell you that if you don't look at all three of these and assess them, your triangle breaks down. You're throwing good money to bad. That brown house didn't flood out that night, and it's not because of the interventions that we did, but it's because of the foresight that we had. We needed to do the street and do the house and look at the family. So take an equity lens, disaggregate your data, get a group together in your community that has the same common goal. It's going to span the funding sources. I heard a lot about funding sources, right? We've got to leverage those funding sources to keep the WMAs going. And then look at what policy and code you can change. What difference can you make? Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And last, we have Dr. Larry Weber. Larry is a co-founder with Vita Kurowski of the Iowa Flood Center, and he served as the director of IIHR for 13 years. He also he is a professor of civil environmental engineering at the University of Iowa and holds the Edwin B. Green Chair in Hydraulics. He serves as the project lead at the IWA project and also serves on multiple committees and councils across the state as the Water Resources Coordinating Council, and he serves on the Governor's Flood Recovery Advisory Board and numerous other state and federal agency committees across the state and nationwide. Welcome, Larry Weber, and let's bring this home.
Thanks, Kate. Well, it's my pleasure, and just to recognize all of the people that have been involved in organizing today's event and speaking as we got started today. And while Jean was talking this morning, and I've known Jerry for a long time and many others here, I think about this a little bit and think about those early papers that you wrote, Jean, and the insight that you had then and living through that for the last 30, 40, 50 years, imagining that data each year coming on those graphs and seeing, those trajectories heading in the direction that they are. I mean, to me, I think this is a really important time for us as a state to take a pause, to think about where we are and where we're going as a state. And with my experience as the director of IIHR for 13 years and co-founding the Iowa Flood Center and co-founding the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, being involved in over 8 years of HUD-funded work across Iowa, I think it's important for me to take a pause to help people think at a little bigger level about where do we want the state to be in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50 years. And so, I'll propose this to strive for a greater balance between agricultural, economic, water, natural, and human resources. These are, 5 of the commons that we should come to expect in the state of Iowa. Our agricultural economy is the lifeblood of our state. We've got to respect the water and natural resources, and we certainly want this state to be a place that future generations want to live, grow their families, and be here. So I've got 7 recommendations. The first one is, we've talked about funding a few different times. HUD has funded these watershed groups. We've funded the creation of the watershed management authorities and some planning work. We need to fund the Iowa's water and land legacy while preserving the formula. Over 60% of the people in the state of Iowa supported the next increase in sales tax. The first 3/8 of a cent would go to a natural resources trust fund that'll generate $160 to $80 million. We need to get that funded. It's been too long in the waiting. This HUD funding is going to end in 2 years. We've got 26 watershed management authorities that are out there. And without the HUD funding, again, with all the hard work that the WMAs are doing, the amount of resources available to them is very, very small. So we've got to be able to fund it. We've got to be able to start building some more natural resiliency into the landscape that we have, and doing that through Iowa's water and land legacy. Second, the natural resources that we do have, we made some investments in them. DNR is a lake restoration program, but unfortunately, in many of the cases where we've put millions of public dollars into lake restoration without adopting nutrient standards for those lakes to protect the lakes after those restoration programs, we see those same lakes with lake closure, with beach closures, with water quality issues. If we're going to invest in these natural resources, we at least need to protect the ones that we have today, and we should be adopting nutrient standards for those lakes. Also, as we think about, the HUD-funded work that we're doing, it's a Flood First project. We're also focused on water quality. We work very, very closely with our colleagues at Iowa State University and the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. We've got to really start accounting for nitrogen N that's applied to our land, require that nitrogen application rates accurately account for manure N, and in total do not exceed, pick a number. Here I'll say or suggest 110% of the maximum return to nitrogen rate, or alternatively apply a luxury tax to fertilizer in excess of the MRTN and use that luxury tax to fund a water quality program. Based on commercial sales of fertilizer at the county scale and applied to watersheds as well as livestock manure, the MRTN across the state of Iowa on average suggests 156 pounds per acre on corn following corn. Currently, we're applying about 191 pounds per acre of nitrogen on those same acres, so that's about 35 pounds in excess. Then we add 63 pounds of manure-based nitrogen on top of that, and we end up with an over-application of manure and plus commercial nitrogen of about 98 pounds an acre. So roughly 100 pounds an acre over-application of nitrogen. In 2017, we had the highest nitrogen load leaving the state of Iowa. We exported just over 1 billion pounds of nitrogen that year. At what point do we start to get our arms around that and curb that continuous increase in nitrogen export, get it to plateau, and perhaps see it go down? At this point, and given all of the data that we have from the Ambient Water Quality Monitoring Network, when we go back to the beginning of that data set, we look at the 5-year moving average, we see that the 5-year moving average is currently up 73% over that period of time. That's a period of time when we're striving to see a 45% reduction in nutrients leaving the state of Iowa, but we're up 73%. The Gulf of Mexico Hypoxia Task Force has suggested that we need a 45% reduction by 2035 to meet Gulf hypoxia goals, with an intermediate target of a 20% reduction by 2025. Based on the data, it appears that we will have doubled our nitrate load leaving the state by 2025. So Jean, like some of the data you've seen and looked at over your life, would we expect that? Do we expect that to happen? I think it's without question that by 2025 we'll have doubled our nitrate load leaving the state. We need to develop a digital geospatial map system so that land that's submitted in manure management plans to the DNR in paper copy are put into a digital system so that we don't have the same parcel of land showing up in multiple manure management plans. That happens. It's documented, it's recorded, but we need to stop over applying manure on those acres. We have some acres in Iowa that not only exceed nitrogen N by 98 pounds, but at the watershed scale, over 350 pounds of manure and commercial fertilizer being applied, so well over 200 pounds in excess of the MRTN. We should consider eliminating the fall application of anhydrous ammonia and fall tillage on soybeans. As Jean mentioned, and as we've seen the last couple of years, we have these wet fall conditions that are happening. We've got changing climate, we've got changing in temperature, we've got fewer frozen soil days. And what's happening is the standard application of applying fertilizer anhydrous ammonia in the fall to soils that are 50 degrees and in a cooling trend. All of a sudden we get a warm December, we get rainfall in December and into January. We've got wet saturated soils, we've got extremely heavily drained soils, which are very leaky, and so we have these tile drain systems that are running all winter long. And so you really have to question how much of that anhydrous ammonia and manure that's being applied in September and October is available to the crop in June. I think that's a question that I think we have to ask very seriously. I would also suggest that we need to discontinue row crop production on 100,000 acres of the 2-year floodplain. Currently, we're farming 276,000 and some change acres that are in the 2-year floodplain. We completed the statewide floodplain mapping a couple years ago, where we mapped the 2-year, the 5-year, the 10, the 25, the 50, the 100, the 200, and the 500-year extents of the floodplain. We've been able to show, in intersecting that data with row crop data, that we farmed 276,000 acres. That contributes in a disproportionate amount to not only our flood risk and flood experiences, but also to water quality. We should strive in a voluntary approach to take 100,000 acres of that 200,000 plus acre floodplain out of row crop production. Several of the County Conservation Board directors that we work with have talked about the recent flooding in northeast Iowa and north central Iowa, all the way out to western Iowa, and say that they have producers and landowners that have a great interest in a buyout, some type of an emergency wetland program that would treat them in a fair and equitable way to take that crop system out of production. And lastly, I'd suggest we should put a moratorium on new confined animal feeding operations and tile drainage until the nitrate loads show a reduction. It's a real challenge as we're working, to get cover crops greater adoption across the state, as we're building wetlands and other conservation practices on various programs, and we celebrate those because of the hard work that goes into getting them built. In the Middle Cedar, over the last 7 years, we've had 1,200 miles of agricultural drainage installed each and every year for 7 years. So that's 8,400 miles of agricultural drainage in one of the 56 huck-8s in the state of Iowa. We install a couple wetlands. When you look at the balance of that agricultural drainage and the conservation work that's going on there, we're just simply not winning. We're not coming close to keeping up with the changes in our landscape. So with that, I'll end my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Just a reminder, if you do have questions, feel free to put them on a card, and there are people walking around that will grab them. And is anybody else on the mic out there? I do have one question I'm going to start off with. Ross, you mentioned that moving water out of Iowa, what is being done regionally to make sure we aren't just passing the problem on to our neighboring states? And maybe some of our other panelists could weigh in on that as well.
We're kind of looking at it in terms of when we're developing these watershed resiliency plans. We tried to take the approach of looking at it from the top of the hill to the bottom. So the most impactful, cost-effective way that we can hold water back is by catching the raindrop as soon as it hits the earth. And the most effective way we have of doing that is improving our soil health. We have 30 million acres of ag land in the state. If we can improve the soil health on those 30 million acres, we can catch a heck of a lot more water. That's going to help a lot of things in terms of flood reduction, water quality, and on down the list. Because of the time it takes to accomplish that, it's not realistic to say that this year we're just going to implement 12.5 million acres of cover crops in the state and start to catch all those raindrops. So, again, on down the hill. So in the event that we do have runoff, looking at a distributed storage system in terms of wetlands or ponds becomes kind of the next step, capturing runoff where we can. And then, last but not least, as Larry just mentioned, looking at those floodplain areas. How do we address areas that are frequently flooded? Trying to pull infrastructure out or prevent further development in those areas. Looking at buyouts in terms of productive lands, so that we're not paying crop insurance claims on those acres constantly. And then looking at additional storage in those and letting the river do what it's supposed to do. I mean, we sometimes forget that flooding is a natural phenomenon, right? A river's supposed to come up and down, but we've altered those waterways in such a way that it's not allowed to spread out. And so as these patterns continue, we need to allow for that as we continue to develop. And so that's kind of how we're looking at that in terms of kind of a top-down approach.
Thank you, Ross. Next up, we have a question of, can you tell a story of individuals or individual whose behavior or action has benefited from the work of the watershed management? Maybe Sharon and Mary Beth?
I mean, we hear stories every day of some of the improvements that we've done. I mean, folks basically wrote off their basements, right? We just don't go down there anymore. And we've got, families with children. We have elderly folks that just, it's just not something that they can afford to do. But I think at the end of the day, we were built off of HUD's Healthy Homes principles, which was dry, clean, safe. pest-free, contaminant-free, and energy efficient. We're replacing furnaces and water heaters in the majority of the homes that we have. Those energy savings are a big deal to someone that's below 80% area median. Just for example, a two-person family in Dubuque is $52,000 a year. So that goes up a little bit for kiddos, when you add that to the mix, but any of these improvements that you can do, I mean, it's just those capital improvements that wouldn't be done any other way. And so then what's the byproduct? We hope that assessed values do improve over time. And what does that produce? Better tax base. So some of this social justice that we start thinking about can come back and flow into those neighborhoods as well.
So Sharon's totally going to win this one. The types of change that Sharon is talking about are immediate, right? Things that we can do today to make life better for people. Change at the watershed scale takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. And I don't want to sit up here and pretend like, instantly watershed management authorities are going to stop flooding next year. It's going to take a lot of time. To me, the successes are in who we're engaging and how we're engaging them. And I guess the story that I would tell is the Middle Cedar Watershed Management Authority. The chair of that group is a farmer from Grundy County. His name is Fred Abels. And he's also a Soil and Water Conservation District Commissioner. And he chairs the Watershed Management Authority because he believes it's the right thing to do, because he believes that farmers have a really important role to play in instituting landscape scale change. It's going to take a lot of time, but he's in it for the long haul, and he's talking to his neighbors and trying to spread the word about why it's important. And by the way, he co-chairs that Watershed Management Authority with Kara Matson. She's the City of Cedar Rapids Stormwater Coordinator. And so here we have a farmer working side by side with a staff person from the City of Cedar Rapids, and they're collaborating and working really hard to find ways to get more practices like what you heard Ross talking about on the landscape. So.
Thank you. Larry, maybe you could touch on this. How do we engage the farming organizations such as Farm Bureau to become part of the solution in land management and reducing row crop in frequent flooded areas?
Well, one of the things that I've said all along when we go out and speak in the watershed meetings is that, we don't have an urban agenda, we don't have a rural agenda, but we do have a science agenda. And I think one of the things that we've got to be open to in the state of Iowa is looking at the data that we have, understanding what it means, and using it in a way to, understand, the challenge of these problems. Like Mary Beth said, we're not going to solve these things overnight, but we've got to start working with some level of urgency. We've got to start understanding that if we don't make some changes, expectations that we're going to see changes in the data are unrealistic. And so how do we, start to bring people together? There are, many farmers across the state, and of course they're, active early adopters in many of the practices. We bring them out, we talk to them, we bring them to panels like this oftentimes. They're doing absolutely wonderful work, but the level of adoption has to increase, and we've got to be able to accelerate it. And we've got to, one, figure out a way, that we can fund that work. We can't put it all on the shoulders of individual producers. We might not be able to put it all on the shoulders of communities. I mean, there's a big agro industry out there as well that, is the third leg in the stool, of suppliers of various inputs into the cropping system. What is their role in conservation? And I think we've got to have, a greater part of that be part of the discussion going forward.
Sure. Antonio, this one's for you. Is there data available at the level to implement perennial type of growth on our landscape that's needed to significantly reduce nutrient runoff?
Yes. As Kate mentioned in the introduction, I work with hydrologic modeling, and I've been using hydrologic modeling and data generated by ISU, the STRIPS project in particular, that have been looking at how the flood reduction benefits and the water quality benefits of implementing native vegetation on the land. So we have been running models, and there is a lot of benefit in implementing strategically native vegetation, and the results of the modeling that we have been doing at the Iowa Flood Center show that if for any reason a landowner decides to take some land out of production, excessive moisture is not profitable anymore, one of the recommendations that I would do if I was asked would be for that landowner to implement native vegetation in those acres.
Thank you, Antonio. Ross, you kind of mentioned this a little bit during your presentation, but what ideas do you have to better merge WMA planning with hazard mitigation planning that has been traditionally been accomplished through the emergency management department or agencies and the council of governments?
That's a good question. I think the mostly what we've seen in the past is that those are basically have happened separately. Any sort of watershed work has kind of been in the conservation bucket, and then disaster mitigation has been more FEMA and looking at recovery efforts and those sorts of things. I think in terms of justifying, I guess there's a couple of things to point out. One would be the investment in mitigation. First of all, I think all departments, whether it be local, state, and federal, are starting to realize investments in mitigation efforts to prevent the severity of these disasters is pennies on the dollar. I think we're starting to see that, and we know that, so the more they can invest in that, the better. The other part of it is making sure to recognize that conservation organizations, soil and water districts, NRCS, NGOs, anybody that's working in the conservation world and looking at landscape efforts are included as potential people to implement hazard mitigation plans. And there's, it's something that has to be directly addressed in the language in those hazard mitigation plans. And that really opens the door to different kinds of funding at the state and national level in terms of pre-disaster hazard mitigation funding and dollars that maybe conservation organizations have never really accessed before. So it's fairly simple process, but there are a number of hurdles that I guess have to be addressed to make it happen.
Can I add to that? So yeah, I thought Ross did a great job of answering that question, but I just wanted to add a couple of things. I really want to emphasize that watershed planning has come a long way in the past 8 to 10 years. It used to be, and I think this was mentioned earlier, possibly by Ross, we would work at a very small local scale to do watershed planning. That makes a lot of sense because where we expect to see change would be at that small sub-watershed scale. We really hammer it with practices, and that's where we start to see water quality and flood mitigation benefits. But now we're involving more regional planning, and we're starting to invite new people to the table. So Travis Beckman, I don't know if Travis left, or oh, there he is. He's been coming to our Clear Creek Watershed Management Authority meetings and helping weigh in on watershed plan development, so that's huge. Jennifer Fensel is with the East Central Iowa Council of Governments. They do a lot of hazard mitigation planning, and they've been leading watershed plans across eastern Iowa. So we have a whole new slate of players who are helping to develop and guide these watershed management plans, which I think is a huge benefit and is really going to move us a little bit closer to getting and achieving more resiliency goals.
Thank you. Larry, you mentioned several crop or land management production issues, but not long ago, the legislator terminated funding for the Aldo Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. That same year also zeroed out the budget for the Iowa Flood Center, but restored at a lesser amount. What is the prospect of restoring that funding for the Aldo Leopold Center?
Oh, I have no idea, so I can't speak to that. I think that one of the things that should be noted, though, and from the speakers that are here and the other resources that we have in the state of Iowa, we have 3 fantastic Regents institutions in the state, and we're very blessed for that. The University of Northern Iowa is doing some fantastic work in prairie grass. environmental science and education, Iowa State University colleagues at the faculty level. We work together on a daily basis. I think the relationship there is absolutely outstanding. And yet sometimes it feels like we have to apologize for this resource or these resources that we have. I think it's unfortunate that there have been some budget cuts that have resulted in the closure or defunding of programs. We've got programs that we could stand up against anybody in the nation, anybody in the world, and I think we should, as a state, take a greater advantage of those resources.
Another one for you, Larry. To obtain changes in agriculture and runoff and improve water quality, we could, 1, offer incentives, 2, make penalties, or 3, command and control regulations. Which one do you feel is best?
Well, again, I think that we've got to take multiple approaches to working on this. I am not an advocate of coming in and saying that we're going to have these very hard and true regulations, and and the cost of that kind of emphasis is going to be very high. But we've got to start putting some kind of common grounds around these, and at a minimum, in the 4 R's program where we talk about the right rate, the right time, the right form, and the right place. Right now we're down an R on rate. And so, if that means a 5th R on regulation, I'm not saying it has to be only to the MRTN, but right now we're over applying, by roughly 100 pounds an acre. We've got to start getting our arms around that. There's discussions that we're hearing, out across Iowa that, one of the real land asset issues in the state is maybe not so much about row crop production, but it's about finding places to apply manure. As our pork production continues to grow in the state, we've got to find places to put that manure on the landscape. And producers don't want to ship it very far. It has a high water content, and so they want to be able to apply that locally. We've got to start thinking about different process or treatment facilities to be able to process that manure and maybe put it in a form that's more suitable for transportation or more usable. But we got to start getting onto this, because just thinking that it's going to solve itself, based on good hope and faith, it's not getting there.
How does the growth of corporate and/or out-of-state land ownership affect the watershed management efforts? Maybe Ross, Mary Beth, Larry.
It already has a massive impact in terms of land management, because and it's growing. The number of absentee landowners, whether it be out of state or even just within the same state, it's becoming more and more of an issue, because the problem is that whether it's inherited land or just land that they bought for investment purposes or whatever, that connection between the owner and the land is not there. And if they're not there to watch what's happening, maybe they don't understand. As long as they're getting their check in the mail for that rent check, they don't necessarily care or understand what's happening on the ground. There are a growing number of examples of conservation lease agreements between landowners and renters that can be a good tool. But it really starts with approaching those landowners to make sure they have some sort of awareness, I guess, of what's happening on their land. Making sure do they understand that, yeah, they're getting a higher check because maybe this producer is going to rent it today, but if you rented it for a little less to this person who's going to do no-till and cover crops, that land's going to hold its value longer. So are they in it for the short term or the long term? There's a lot of, I guess, need to do that. I'm not sure the best way to approach it because of the spatial distribution of landowners. And as that problem as that issue, I guess, continues to grow, it's going to be definitely a need to be addressed a little bit and more.
I just want to add to that. Ross mentioned conservation lease agreements, and we actually have a landowner in the room today, Al Shafbo, who is working on with his tenets on conservation. And I just want to acknowledge you because I think that's really fantastic. You're probably going to kill me, but just wave your hand anyway, Al.
As we acquire more and more public land and easements, federal, state, locally, how do we fund the management of more federal land turned over to state management?
Well, certainly there's a state element to that. There's also several of the county conservation, the counties in Iowa have also moved forward with their own bond funds, to either purchase or manage lands for, in Lynn County's case, it's specifically for water quality improvements. And so we're seeing, county level activities to raise additional funds while the state is waiting to implement the Iowa Water and Land Legacy. So I guess that's one answer.
I do have a couple. Okay. This one's for Larry. How likely are we to pass a CAFO moratorium or discontinue row cropping on 100K acres in the 2-year floodplain? What's the key strategy for targeting to get this done?
Well, it comes back, to the state in some way trying to decide what's important for the state of Iowa, and how do we have a conversation statewide, and is that through, perhaps, looking at the water plan for the state of Iowa, which hasn't been updated for many years. It comes back to leadership. It comes back to, people trying to decide what they want to do. And oftentimes in the local watershed management authorities, they're establishing goals for flood mitigation and water quality improvement. They're establishing goals for cover crop adoption. They're putting timelines on those. And so we're seeing leadership from those watershed management authorities. In order to start to work towards these state level goals, we would have to have, leadership at the state level adopt some of those goals. And so I think, again, there's a lot of, there's interest certainly in some areas from producers and landowners that have seen repetitive flood damages, but they need to be treated in a fair and equitable way. And so we've got to come up with a fund, that allows those lands to come out of production and for that farmer to be appropriately compensated.
So I'm going to share a little bit right now. I don't have an answer to the question, but I just would like to share. I meet a lot with local counties and communities. And I've been in a situation in multiple counties recently where county supervisors have approached me about CAFOs in their counties and concerns that they have about them, and just wondering what it would take for there to be more local control. I don't really want to share an opinion on that right now, but I just think it's important for people to understand that counties are grappling with this issue. They're not sure what to do about it. A lot of them are facing a really high influx of new permit applications. So it's something out there that people are really thinking a lot about. And I just thought it was important to share that. Supervisors from both sides of the aisle are really wondering where this is going to go in the future.
Another question for you, Mary Beth. Is there any standard for watershed planning in Iowa? Are all watershed plans including the same things? Are they taking the same factors into consideration? And who oversees this?
So watershed planning is really dynamic. It really reflects the local situation and the specific water quality and hydrology conditions of that local area. As far as standards, yes, we do have some at DNR. We follow EPA planning guidelines. It's referred to the 9-element planning framework. That has a pretty high bar in terms of doing the appropriate modeling and assessment in order to identify pollutant sources, estimate pollutant loads, and develop a very specific plan as far as the conservation practices required to meet those pollutant load reduction targets. They don't all include the same thing. We're going to have certain watersheds that have bigger issues with nitrates. Other, especially where we've got drinking water sources. Other watersheds are dealing with concerns with total phosphorus, especially our lake watersheds where they're seeing excessive algae blooms. Other watersheds are dealing with E. coli issues, pathogen issues. So yeah, it's just really dynamic. DNR does provide some oversight for watershed plans depending on the funding source. If we're funding the watershed plan, obviously we do have a big role to play in reviewing and approving it. We provide technical assistance. Myself and my counterpart who works out in Western Iowa, we do provide a lot of technical assistance for watershed plan development. So, you know, we like to be involved, but there are certainly other watershed plans being developed by other entities that we're a little bit less involved with. Iowa Soybean Association has been heavily involved in watershed planning. RC&D, obviously, a lot of other entities are taking the lead on watershed planning as well.
Thank you. And the last question I have, we're going to have everybody kind of answer and go through. So what is your highest priority for future flood prevention? And maybe some last final thoughts.
So I'll go first. You know, I really think that we've been very fortunate to get HUD funding in the state of Iowa. We've been very fortunate to have 26 watershed management authorities formed. We have several others that are in the forming process. Highest priority would be to find real, renewable, reliable funding to help support these programs. And I think that would most appropriately be an I will.
Well, I can't echo that enough. But I think there are precedents that do say this HUD funding will leverage more. You've got to have a big group at the table helping you write those applications that have the subject matter expertise. And as I look around with the royalty that I'm up here with, I mean, these are your experts in this state, and you need to lean on them. I didn't hear one of them say, "Don't call me," right? We all are in this together. I would say this, you know, I'm at a local level, but our city wants to be more resilient. It's not that there isn't, you know, a community that doesn't, but I'm trying to figure out some of those nuts and bolts items that we can do that we do have control over. And I think, you know, it gets overwhelming thinking about all the things that we can't control. There are things that you can. You've got to seek those out. The other big item that I've learned over the last few years was just finding those anchors in the community that are always going to be there. Higher ed, maybe religious, maybe energy sector, you know, our ag organizations. Thinking about what those are in your organization, the school districts that are committed to looking at the future of your community and really engaging them, starting a conversation and keeping it going. So.
I would say if I had to think about it and just, you know, put it on one thing, the most important investment, you know, at least initially, that Iowa can make at a state level is investing in people. You know, Sharon gave really great stories and examples of what's happening in Dubuque at a very detailed level. Well, it's happening because Sharon is there. She's working there. You know, for those communities that don't have that, those things aren't happening. It's the same thing at the watershed scale. You know, we have 26 WMAs. They don't all have a coordinator. So, you know, the level of implementation or resiliency planning, it's, you know, is that going to happen if there's not a person there working on it? You know, a good example in just the small region that I work in Northeast Iowa, you know, Winnebago County in the very northeast corner of the state is one of the most active soil and water districts and spends some of the highest amounts of conservation dollars with their landowners every year. Well, they have multiple soil and water district employees, a singular district conservationist, and so they've engaged a good portion of that county. You go just a little ways into Chickasaw County, which is just to the southwest. 0 soil and water district employees. They have a district conservationist who is shared between 2 counties, and it's a completely different level of engagement with those producers. So there's no person there that's necessarily tasked with engaging those landowners. So whether it's a conversation about application rate or you know how to put your water heater up on bricks in the basement, if there's nobody there to have that conversation, it may not happen. So, you know, it has a price tag on it, as Mary Beth pointed out. You know, it's not a cheap solution necessarily, but it may be the most impactful. It's just having somebody there to answer questions and engage that person and provide some level of connection at different scales to individuals so that they know that there may be other options for them to act and maybe very cost-effective options that don't require public assistance. But that would be, I guess, my number one thing is an investment in people in the state to help put things on the ground.
So I second what Ross said. That was my number one as well. That's the danger of not going first, I suppose. But as to not belabor that point, I would point to another one, which is really high on my priority list as well, and that's public education. I learned so much today. There's really great science presented in a really understandable way. And in fact, I was chatting with someone at my table that this information just needs to get in the public eye as much as possible. And I think all of us who are here today really have a call to action on that. You know, we need to be talking about this. We need to normalize all of this information. And it just needs to be hitting people on multiple levels. You know, kids at school need to be getting this information. It needs to be coming from our local news sources. There need to be, you know, full-blown media campaigns that are introducing people to the types of activities they can be doing, what they can be doing in their own homes, on their own properties, so that we can start to get conservation and, you know, resilience to be a bigger part of the discussion.
So I would say that the biggest priority, in addition to funding and investing in people, should be on nature-based solutions to flooding. Soil health, cover crops, native vegetation. From the science standpoint, in my opinion, that should be the emphasis, nature-based solution as opposed to structural practices.
Thank you, everyone. Let's give them a round of applause.